No, you go first. No, you go first. No, you go first.
It's more grass. It's more grass.
I'm talking about lions, you lions, you...
There's people shouting and talking and sneezing and farting.
And that's the great thing about East Africa.
You're welcome.
You can also fly there from America, from the States. That's the same place.
But, and this is a capital B-U-T.
Of animals, it's like a...
You absolutely nailed it.
Because you will. Once you've done safari once, you'll come back.
Hi, and welcome back to episode 7 of the Safari Shots podcast. And today we're going to be talking about East Africa versus Southern Africa and focusing specifically on photographic safaris. And when I say we, I mean me and my co-host, Lance Photographic. Lance, welcome back.
Hello, hello. Thanks very much.
It's great to see you, Lance. Before we start talking about these safaris in East Africa and Southern Africa, I just quickly want to touch on 3 small important things. The first thing is I have finally posted the safari vlog that I shot at King's Camp when Lance and I went to film episode 6 of the podcast in the King's Warren Underground Hide at King's Camp. So make sure you go and check that out. And then secondly, some of you might be wondering why we haven't done the little trophy announcement for the best Mashatu shot that we spoke about in episode 5 of the Safari Shots podcast. And the reason for that is we are still getting entries coming in. So we decided we'll wait a little bit until we have a little bit of a photographic face-off again. So hang tight for that one and make sure to go and check out episode 5 and cast your vote there.
And keep voting for me because I was getting smashed.
Hey, that's cheating. And then the third thing, that brings me back to you, Lance, is I want to congratulate you for winning 2 professional categories in the 2023 South African Photographer of the Year. I know that you just got back from Cape Town. Tell us a little bit about which shots they were and how the that evening was.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. I'm sure we'll overlay the photos here somehow with some trickery magic. I actually have to thank you, first of all, because in the competitions podcast that we did, you actually sparked a memory in my brain that I had taken some cool slow shutter shots. And I actually said in that podcast, that actually reminds me, I've got a shot to enter for next year. Thanks very much. And that's actually the shot that won the professional mammals category. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I owe you a half a shoe. And then, oddly, I won the professional birds category as well with the same sighting but on a different day of a Cape vulture that basically told a hyena where to go when the hyena tried to chase it away.
Yeah, congratulations, Lance. Man, I couldn't believe it when you let me know that you had 2 images as category winners. So congratulations for that. And I think let's jump straight into our theme for today, which is basically comparing photographic safaris in East Africa. So that's basically talking Tanzania and Kenya. So the Serengeti system and the Masai Mara system versus Southern Africa. And that includes Botswana, Zimbabwe, and of course, South Africa. Lance, I'm going to put you on the spot right from the start and ask you, if you had to tell me now, what's your favorite, East Africa or Southern Africa, what would you say?
Oh. So, they are so different, which is why we wanted to do this talk about them. But if you told me I could only choose one to photograph for the rest of my life, I would have to go with East Africa. And that's purely because the densities of game, the nice wide open spaces which are beautiful for photographers, the landscapes, I think there's very pretty landscapes in Southern Africa, but I think the East African landscapes are prettier. And the amount of images I come home with every time from East Africa versus Southern Africa. So listen, Southern Africa, I've got some amazing shots, but the amount of shots that I keep from East Africa, I would say that East Africa for me would win. And what about you?
Oh, it's very interesting you say that because I've just come back from a whole month in East Africa. So I spent just over a week in the Masai Mara. And then I spent time in the Ngorongoro crater, in the Serengeti itself, and then around in Ndutu as well. And in fact, I was in Amboseli as well, which is that quintessential East African scenes with Mount Kilimanjaro in the background.
Stunning.
And I agree with you in that the landscape makes a big difference, and so does the volume of animals, so the actual numbers of animals.
Yeah.
And I think it's those two things combined that are the big draw cards for East Africa. I mean, in Southern Africa, you're never going to see hundreds of thousands of wildebeest. You've got nothing
Yeah.
that resembles Mount Kilimanjaro or the dramatic nature of going down the Ngorongoro crater. I promise you, when I drove down the edge of the Ngorongoro crater those 2 mornings, I thought to myself, this is the best thing I've ever done. It's just the feeling that you get when you do that is quite amazing. So I agree with you when it comes to the look of the shots and the feel of the shots. Your East African shots are going to give you something much more dramatic, and those open spaces make it so much easier to get those shots. But, and this is a capital B-U-T, the big but for me, and I thought about it so much while I was going through those beautiful reserves for the whole month, I missed the exclusivity of the sightings in Southern Africa's private game reserves. And what I mean by that is when you're in East Africa in places like the Masai Mara and the Serengeti National Park and the Ngorongoro Conservation Area where you find Ndutu and the Ngorongoro Crater, in none of those places you have vehicle restrictions at sightings. In other words, you could have up to 50 vehicles at one sighting, believe it or not, especially if you're there during the busy times. Whereas in the places where Lance and I typically do our safaris in Southern Africa, like Mashatu in Botswana, or the Sabi Sands here in the Greater Kruger, there's typically a 3-vehicle limit at sightings. And that means you could sit with a leopard in a tree and just have that animal in complete silence to yourself and just enjoy the peace and quiet. And I miss that. So I don't know what your feeling is about that, and how much does that actually bother you when you're on safari?
There's pros and cons to both. So I've recently done quite a few trips now to the Timavati and the Klasiri, which is very close to myself. Where we live, which is really nice for us. That is nicer than going to East Africa because we don't lose a day. We just drive 20, 30 minutes. So that's a pro for here. But there's pros and cons to both. So in the Klasiri and the Timavati, there's actually a 2-vehicle limit in a sighting, which is great for you while you're there. But unfortunately, it does mean that all the other guys are lining up behind you. And so your time tends to be a little bit shorter in a sighting. So, that can be a bad thing or a good thing as well. If your guide is very good and he's gotten you into the sighting at the right time of day, the animal's awake, not sleeping. I'm talking about lions, you then you can have a really cool sighting, and you won't know, well, now we had to leave and that kind of thing. If you get into the sighting at the perfectly wrong time, it's actually a downer. We had a sighting now of wild dogs. We got in, they were asleep. We actually left straight away so that we could try and come back, because as a photographic safari, sleeping wild dogs in long grass is useless. So we left. And then we got back into the lineup, but I was listening on the radio. Some of the other guys also had the same idea. And they were also trying to, no, you go first, no, you go first, no, you go first. And eventually nobody went first. So we went back, and then we essentially had 10 minutes, which sucked. So the dogs got up. They didn't do their normal greeting ceremony, which they normally do, which is very cool to photograph, which we would have been happy with. They just stood there staring at each other for the 10 minutes that we had. And as we pulled out, they took off and started hunting. So that kind of thing in Southern Africa can be a dampener. It doesn't happen everywhere. It's sad to say, the higher price you pay, the more exclusive the lodge, the less vehicles, the more time you will get in a sighting. But in East Africa, because it's kind of a free-for-all, you don't have to leave. Sometimes you have to struggle to get into a position. Most of the places they are good. The crossings are a nightmare because there's nowhere to line up. Everyone's just wherever they can be. Cat sightings, they tend to do it very well because it's open. There's no bushes and trees in the way. They'll tend to put all the vehicles on one side, so you're not photographing into vehicles. So that does work. Even if there's 30 vehicles there, if you're concentrating on the animals, you kind of don't notice them.
Well, I'll tell you what my feeling is about that because, like I said, I literally just experienced that. So it's so fresh in my memory. I find that the problem in East Africa is when you have all those vehicles, the guys who are patient at least lining up. Let's say 30 people find a leopard chilling in a tree and everybody's patient enough to wait for it to come out. The problem is the moment that leopard jumps out of the tree or the cheetah leaves its kill or the lions wake up, it's absolute chaos. And then you get a lot of photo bombing of vehicles. So from a photographic point of view, it only works for that time that the animal is stationary. But you know as well as I do that very often the best shots are when that animal starts getting active. So that's one big problem there. And the second thing is while you're sitting there waiting for the animal to move, it's not quiet. There's people shouting and talking and sneezing and farting and kids crying and guides talking loudly to each other about, who knows what. So that for me is one thing that I really don't like. And I must be honest with you, what I typically do when I'm there is I actually try and convince my guide not to stay at those sightings. If I don't feel like that's really going to turn into something amazing, I'd rather go the other way and look for something else because it's big open spaces and there's often other things to find.
And that's the great thing about East Africa. You can drive a kilometer and find another pride of lions that nobody's got to yet because they haven't heard them on the radio. There's so much game there that you can literally leave what could potentially be a really nice sighting and go and find a better one. Whereas in Southern Africa, you can do that as well, but it's less likely. Smaller properties, smaller areas where the guides can actually traverse. So there may only be one pride of lions, for example, in the property at once. Whereas East Africa, you can drive 40 kilometers that way. You can bump into, we hit 87 lions in 6 nights on our last Tanzania trip. So you can't do that in South Africa.
Well, so that's why I think it's so important for people to go with photographic safari guides like ourselves, because we can help make that decision at the sighting. So when you're in East Africa on your own with your driver/guide, he's always going to be inclined to go where everybody else is going. Whereas if you and I are there with our clients, we can say, listen, guys, I can tell you this is going to turn into an absolute sideshow when this animal moves. Let's rather go and look for something else. And I did that a lot on my recent safari there. And back to Southern Africa, what you just explained is exactly the reason why I like going to the places like Mala Mala and like Mashatu. It's those places that are a little bit more expensive, but they've got these massive, massive concessions. And what that means is that there are more leopards, prides of lions, and things to go and look for. So what you typically find at those kind of reserves is that if you find something, you can stay for as long as you want, or at least for much longer than you would in places with very small concessions and lots of guides.
Absolutely.
And it helps a lot if it is a concession where only one company's guides drive. So Mala Mala is a good example, and so is Mashatu. So basically that means that, you're not competing for sightings with another lodge. And that happens a lot at these private game reserves in Southern Africa. So for me, I must be honest with you, I much prefer sitting in a very quiet sighting with only 3 vehicles in Mala Mala or Mashatu, hopefully for as long as I possibly could, so that when that leopard jumps out of the tree or the lion pride gets active, I'm not competing with all those other vehicles. But again, you sacrifice those beautiful landscapes of East Africa and the high volume, of animals.
So for me, one of the biggest things when guests come to us and they want to talk about Kenya or Tanzania is we normally try and aim them towards private concessions. If they're looking for migration and crossings, particular crossings, then you have to go to the national parks. The national parks are where it's a zoo. It's the 50 million vehicles. But if they're interested in maybe seeing a crossing or two, but then they just really want to see animals, we normally recommend the private concession, especially Kenya side. They have beautiful private concessions, which are still attached to the Mara and things like that. So it's basically kind of like the Greater Kruger here in South Africa. And there they do have vehicle restrictions, which is great. So it's still 5 versus 3 here. But remember, there's no thick bushes. So your 5 vehicles can line up very nicely in a small patch on this side, and then you're never shooting vehicles. So we do that a lot. there's lots of nice private concessions. We go there, we have a great time. There's lots of photographic vehicles in East Africa, which I think are laid out a lot better than Southern Africa. And we'll talk about vehicles now. And because of the landscape, and it's mostly grassland and wide open spaces, you can shoot with a longer lens on a photo vehicle with the sides cut out so you can lie down, and you can park further away and look like you're on the floor, which is very difficult to do in Southern Africa. There's a couple of reserves. So Mashatu's got a very nice photo vehicle. Other than that, there's not many great photo vehicles in Southern Africa. And what that means is that all those sort of iconic shots of just a lion with these magnificent skies, which you get in East Africa, are possible there. Whereas here, they're a lot harder because even if you can get low, the vegetation is very thick.
But just to clarify, those private concessions that you just spoke about, those are predominantly in Kenya on the edge of the Masai Mara.
Yes.
The moment you go to Amboseli with Mount Kilimanjaro and you cross the border into Tanzania and you're doing the Serengeti, the Ngorongoro crater, Ndutu, they don't exist. So that's really only for a very small portion of East Africa.
Yes.
For the rest of the time, if you are going to do the public areas or the public reserves and conservation areas in East Africa, I suggest just going in the low season. So that might mean, maybe going during a more rainy time of the year, or maybe a typical time that people don't travel. For us this year now, it was sort of end of February, early March. And that could actually make a significant difference. And again, where companies like Panthera Photo Safaris will help you make those decisions. If you're not necessarily going for the big river crossings in the Masai Mara, which is typically from August to October, you've got the whole rest of the year to try and limit those vehicle numbers, which I think play a significant role. But while we're speaking on vehicles, I know you just mentioned in those private concessions on the edge of the Mara, you've got your vehicles that are designed specifically for photography. But if we go to all those other public places like Amboseli, like Ngorongoro crater, like the Serengeti, you're in the closed land cruises. Whereas in South Africa and Southern Africa, like Botswana and Zimbabwe, you're typically in an open Land Cruiser or Land Rover, sometimes with a little roof at the top, but 99% of the time, or actually I would say 100% of the time, you're open all the way around the sides. What's your feeling about these open vehicles in Southern Africa versus the closed vehicles in East Africa, where the roof pops up?
Again, there's pros and cons. So nothing quite beats an open vehicle where the wind is in your face and the dust is in your teeth and you're cooking in the sun. In East Africa, you tend to spend a lot more time on game drive. And you actually want a roof because you are out there for so long that you will get nailed by the sun in particular. In Southern Africa, your game drives tend to be 3.5 to 4 hours max. In the afternoons, it's like 2 hours of sunlight and then a little bit into darkness plus sunset. So as far as a non-restricted view of shooting goes, an open vehicle is 1,000,000 times better because you can shoot any angle that you want. So if the animal's walking along here, you've got a full line of sight the whole way. Whereas on a closed vehicle like in East Africa, you have your shooting window or you have to be out the top of the roof. And then
changing your angle.
Roof, you're very high. You're shooting down, which is never great. However, in saying that, we've noticed lately that the open vehicles in Southern Africa, your seats are staggered. So front is low, middle's here so that you can see over these guys, and the back's quite high. So a lot of the guys like the front row. On our workshops, we always rotate so that everyone gets a fair go. There's pros and cons to being high and low as well. Long grass, you want to be at the back where you're a bit higher. Short grass, you want to be in the front where it's a bit lower. Whereas in East Africa, a lot of those vehicles are much longer. So it's the same vehicle, but they've extended almost. But the seats are the same height because you're shooting out of a window. So the guys in the back have got the exact same field or shooting angle that you guys have got in the front. So that is very nice. And then also, even in the Masai Mara in Tanzania now, they're popping up all over the place. Proper photo vehicles where the whole side is a window, either with canvas, and now the bottom drops out completely, and you can put little rails there with your gimbals and things like that for really getting low and shooting. So yeah, I like the Southern African open vehicles, but when I'm sitting in the sun for more than 4 hours, I really like the East African closed vehicles. Plus, those guys always have a fridge. There's cold drinks that are with a fridge plugged in and that kind of stuff, whereas the Southern African vehicles don't have that. So yeah, it's a completely different experience, and I actually really like both.
Well, I think it's important to mention these differences because I think a lot of people, they just think, oh, Africa, safari, it's going to be the same. Where in actual fact, the two experiences are completely different. And I think that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to give you an idea of what it feels like to be in East Africa in a closed vehicle versus in Southern Africa in an open vehicle. And I'll tell you what I think about it. I agree with you that I like the shooting experience, the photography experience in an open vehicle, because if there's a bird sitting in a tree, it's just easy to lift your camera. You don't have that issue. And if the guide doesn't park perfectly, you have a bigger scope to photograph from. But there's something about the East African vehicles where you can stand while you drive that I really like.
Yes.
So, we sit for such long periods of time in vehicles and you get stiff and you feel like you can't move around. Whereas in East Africa, it's so nice to be able to stand up, hold on to the side, and then scan for animals like that. And I do actually like photographing out the top, even though you then sacrifice a little bit of the blurry background with the angle. But what I don't like at all, and you might disagree with me, and I know a lot of people would disagree with me, I don't like the typical East African way of doing game drives that last so long. So like Lance said a second ago, you leave early in the morning at sunrise, but very often these drives only get back after midday. So you'll get back at 12 o'clock or sometimes even 1 o'clock, go straight to lunch, and then maybe have half an hour to an hour and you head out early again, like 3 o'clock. And it basically means you're on game drive pretty much the whole day. And for me, it just gets terribly exhausting. And for a very big part of that time, you are driving during harsh light. So you're not actually, even though you're seeing things, you're not having great photographic opportunities. And I actually, a few times on this recent trip to East Africa, had to say to the drivers and convince the guests, listen, guys, it's 10 o'clock. We've gotten our great shots. Let's head back to camp and we can relax a little bit, maybe do a bit of photo editing, eat, sleep, and go out again. Whereas in Southern Africa, like Lance said, you head out early, but you come back kind of between 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock because it simply gets too hot. So I'd have to say there are definitely pros and cons to both, but I typically like the shorter morning drives, shorter afternoon drives, and really optimizing your photography during the best sort of golden light.
The only time we recommend, well, not even recommend, the only time we kind of tolerate full day drives, because you were saying sometimes you come back after lunch. Sometimes you don't even do that. Sometimes you stay out. Literally, you go out at sunrise and you come back at sunset. The only time we would tolerate those as a photographic company is if we are specifically looking for cheetahs hunting, because in Southern Africa they hunt early and late like a normal cat. In Eastern Africa, they hunt like they say in the book. They hunt a lot at midday because the lions, which there's millions of, and the hyenas, which there's millions of, are sleeping. In Southern Africa, they don't do that because they've got enough cover where they can hunt like a normal cat. So they still hunt during the nice times of day. So East Africa, if we're looking specifically for cheetah hunts and we haven't seen one, we'll maybe sit throughout the day and follow a specific cheetah. Otherwise, the only other time is crossings. Crossings can happen any time from early in the morning, which is a low chance, midday where there's a higher chance, and then a low chance again in the afternoon. But they can happen at any time. But the majority of them happen right smack bang in the middle of the stinking hot heat of the day. And those are the two things that we would say, listen, this is what we've come for. Let's push for it. You'd pack a lunch. You'd take a picnic out. Let's really try and focus on it. But if it's a general, especially predator workshop, or just a nice photo safari, we tell the guides exactly the same thing. And they always look very confused. We go out, we spend 3.5, 4 hours. Once the light is really harsh, it's useless for us now. And then we go back to the camp, we refresh, we do some editing, we chill, and then you're not as tired as well. So you're actually prepared to catch the shots when they happen. Because a lot of the guys are so zonked that do full days that they actually miss shots because their brain is fried by the time the shots happen. We did a safari last year. Yeah, so coming back to the out of season stuff, your trip was just now in March. It was a very good time to go for, not for crossings, but early migration, the calving season and that kind of stuff. We did one the year before, also March. So nice and quiet in Amboseli. We had really good migration, huge herds down in the south. One of the days, though, sadly, we had to drive a long way because we had to drive from Karatu to central Serengeti, which is stink far. I think it's about 6 or 7 or 8 hours or whatever it was. Game drive on the way, but it's far. If you can fly in, fly in. So by the time we got there, there was a very cool scene happening all around us where hundreds of thousands of zebras were coming in to drink at one little waterhole with some sleeping lions. And some people didn't want to stay there because they were too tired. So they had actually already gone. We saw lots of vehicles pull in, sleeping lions leave. Luckily, we had the foresight of saying, listen, but there's lions here and these zebras have to come here. And we saw a lion kill that day. So they killed a zebra right in front of us. And some people didn't get it because they were just too tired. Gone. The day was too long. Yeah. So
I think another thing that leads to the fatigue is, the road conditions in East Africa.
Oh yeah.
I tell you, both in the Masai Mara and in the Serengeti system, it's very muddy when it rains. And when that dries out, and especially if some elephants have walked over those roads, it gets incredibly rutted. So you're bouncing around all the time. And the further back you sit in that vehicle, the more tired you become. Yeah. Whereas in Southern Africa, most of the reserves, because they are privately owned and the concessions are smaller, they are maintained, much better. So if a part of the road gets eroded or washed away, they'll fix it. So I typically find that my game drives in Southern Africa are a lot more comfortable than they are in East Africa. And I think it's also got to do with the fact that you're not traveling as big a distance on your drives in Southern Africa. But the fact that you can stand up in those vehicles in East Africa does help you to just recover a little bit. But then standing up again is a whole different sort of, your suspension works quite hard. So if you've got bad knees or hips, that can be quite tough. Yep. But something else that I want to mention, a couple of things that I just want people to understand is that if you book a safari either in Southern Africa in one of the private game reserves or in East Africa, if you don't do it through a photographic safari company like Panthera Photo Safaris, you will most likely be put with other people, or very often put with other people. So you could go to a lodge and they might actually fill up all the seats. In the Sabi Sands, that might be up to 9 people in the vehicle, so 3 in a row. And in East Africa, that's often, it could be 10 people, you're right. In East Africa, that could be 6 to 9.
We just talked to a lodge yesterday, and they told us they put 10 people on a vehicle, and I was like, okay, thanks very much.
That's nuts. That's absolutely nuts. And
that's every single seat plus the one in the front next to the driver. How are you supposed to take photos out of that?
That's absolutely nuts. And that's why I strongly recommend that if you're coming on a photographic safari to either destination, use a company like Panthera Photo Safaris, where someone like Lance will make sure that you're only 3 or maybe 4 people in the vehicle and you have the road to yourself. It's just about getting a little bit more space in the vehicle. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that there is quite a big difference in the guiding style in Southern Africa versus East Africa. Because in East Africa, how it typically works is you'll have a guide that's really often called a driver. So his main job is to get you at sightings, and that's an important job, and then obviously to position as well. But he's constantly talking to his friends on WhatsApp. They're so busy that they're just on the radio all the time, talking. But it's because they're covering those massive areas, and all they're trying to do is get you into good sightings. But I find that very seldom do those guys do a lot of interpretation and talk a lot and give you some information about those specific animals and the area. You often have to ask before you get information. Whereas in Southern Africa, what you'll find, you'll often have a guide that is very good in terms of telling you what you can expect from the drive, what you're seeing, whether that's trees, animals, birds. And it has I think, a much nicer way of experiencing the bush. But having said that, if that guide is not used to having photographers, it can actually be a little bit frustrating because you're not making fast progress getting to your sightings. So they might be talking about a termite mound and using half an hour of your good light when you actually want to be looking for predators. And again, all the more reasons to go on a scheduled photographic safari where me or Lance can help that guide make decisions about how long you stop for things. So I just want to make sure that people understand that there are big, big differences in the road conditions and how many vehicles and people are in a vehicle, but also the way that the guides, interpret and move through the environment.
So you're 100% right. East Africa is a little bit different in when the guides get a job at a lodge. That's typically where they'll stay for a very, very long time, if not forever. Some of the guides then move out and they have their own private guiding service, which is quite nice. We actually use a lot of those guides. They own their own vehicles, so you'll stay at a lodge, but we'll have our own guides that we have a good relationship with. We've been with them a lot of times. They know what we're after. They know how we work, which is great. Southern Africa is a little bit different, especially so South Africa. The guiding is typically a younger person's job. I think you'd agree with that.
Yeah, totally.
Guides tend to guide from when they leave university or college up until their mid or late 30s, and then they go to management or they leave the bush. But during that time, those guides want to work at the best places. And the best places only take the most qualified guides. So the level of qualifications in Southern Africa tend to be a lot higher. And your guiding experience, therefore, is better because they won't get the job if they're not better than the 100 or 1,000 other guys that are applying for the one job. So, definitely the guiding in Southern Africa is a lot better. There are very good guides everywhere that you'll agree. We meet them along the way, and those are the ones that we stick to and glue to.
Yes.
But you're right. Another thing I wanted to touch on, it used to be a lot easier getting to Southern African lodges than it was East Africa. But that's kind of changing now. So the nice thing is, depending on where you're coming from in the world and where you're going to, you can fly directly to Kenya now from South Africa. You can also fly there from America, from the UK, from the States. That's the same place. But also South Africa. So fly straight into either Nairobi in Kenya. You can fly into Tanzania as well, and you can fly into Johannesburg. You can also then get on a short plane, and I recommend flying into all of these places rather than driving. You can get on a short plane. Within a half an hour to an hour, you're in the reserve. And that's all the countries now, which is fantastic. Your prices will vary a little bit, but you're tending to spend between about $300 and $500 per person per flight. But the nice thing is, almost everywhere now, East Africa and Southern Africa, within an hour or two, you can actually be in a reserve. There are still some places in East Africa which are not the case. They are very difficult to line up. Whereas Southern Africa's got a slight edge on that. But the majority of the places now are very easy to get to, which is awesome.
Well, I think that's one thing that I really like about places like the Sabi Sands is because you can fly from Johannesburg to Eastgate here in Hoedspruit or down to Skukuza in the Kruger National Park and then take a short road transfer. It's probably the easiest, cheapest way to get to some of the best lodges in Southern Africa. But I agree with you. If you can afford it, absolutely take those charter flights and just fly into your destination. 100%. It saves you road time, you're less fatigued, and you just get to your camp as quickly as possible. And when it comes to prices, you'll know better than I do because this is a little bit more your world. But am I right in saying that if you're going to the best places or the nicest places, those places where You don't have tiny concessions, and you have the best guides and the biggest, chance of seeing great things. East Africa and Southern Africa is actually very similarly priced.
It is.
There's not a major price difference between the two places.
Yeah. So it's always difficult for us as photographers, because normally when we want to go to even the cheap places, we want a vehicle to ourselves. So you can find lodges where the sleeping rate is about 5,000 Rand or less, so about $250 to $300 roundabout. But then to ensure that you're not with 7 other people on the vehicle that don't want to do photography with you, they want to go and look at butterflies and birds and rocks. Meanwhile, you want to sit with the sleeping leopard. Then you're paying also anywhere between $200 and $400 and $700 or even $1,000 to get a private vehicle. So it's difficult. The lodges, there's cheap and there's medium and there's expensive lodges in all of these places, and the prices are actually quite similar now. But once you start looking into private vehicles and stuff, it gets thrown all over the place. But the nice thing is we know lodges that if you have a certain budget. The sad thing is, though, for now, to get a private vehicle and things, there's not many options that are, I would say, cheap. There's no options that are cheap. There's very few which are reasonable, and then you're looking at quite expensive, sadly, which is sad. It's very limiting.
Well, I have a very top tip to actually share to people, because, and you mentioned it when you spoke about butterflies and birds. The whole reason for going on these private photographic safaris is to avoid being put with these other people that take up too much space. But what I've seen also happens is, if you're booking even a private scheduled photographic safari that, let's say, has space for 6 to 10 people, and I know, Lance, you do these kind of trips, you have space for a number of people, more than just a bespoke trip for a family. There's a big risk that you end up in a vehicle, even if it's just 1 or 2 other people that have other photographic needs. So one person is desperately looking to photograph wild dogs specifically, but the others are happy to photograph anything. And even that can then cause some frustration, because some people want to look for this and others want for others. So the top tip is that if you can, try and travel with friends. So in other words, find out from your photographic safari guide or agency like Panthera Photo Safaris how many people sit in each of the vehicles, because sometimes Lance would have booked 2 vehicles. And if Lance says it's 3 maximum or 4 maximum, contact your friends and see if you can get a group of people together that are like-minded and photograph the same things, because that just means that there's less chance of having friction in the vehicle, because some people want to stop for birds and other people want to look just for cats. You're going to have a much better experience if you're there with people that you know, or at least people that like photographing the same things.
And if you and going further than that, if you really can, and your only goal is pure photographic, if you really can, book alone. If you can go just yourself or just you and your partner with a photographic guide, then every single thing that you do will be what you want to do. So we had that now. This is one of the best safaris I've ever done in my life. Last year, 2 guys, they only wanted to photograph leopards. We did 9 nights in Mushatu, and we saw 35 leopards in I think it was 13 drives, because we did hides as well. And because it was them alone, and that's all they wanted to do, that's all we did. And it was, honestly, it was such a treat. So obviously that's not easy, because if you're alone and you're paying for a private vehicle, you alone are paying for that private vehicle. You alone are covering the guide costs. So they are definitely not cheap. Please don't even inquire about a single cheap private safari. They do not happen. But if you can, and you're fortunate enough, it is the most rewarding way to get into wildlife photography, or get the best wildlife photography images that you're after, because there's no one else there to kind of screw up your plans, if that makes sense.
No, I totally agree with you. We're tailing off a little bit because obviously now that goes for East Africa and Southern Africa. But getting back to the one versus the other, up to now, I may have sounded a little bit like I'm Team Southern Africa as opposed to Team East Africa. But what I will say is that, and it comes back to something we mentioned right at the beginning, in terms of the numbers of animals in that landscape, nothing beats East Africa. A couple of examples.
Absolutely.
On this trip now, we had herds of elephants in front of Mount Kilimanjaro. There's nothing like that in Southern Africa. Driving down the rim of the Ngorongoro crater, and everything you see at the bottom has this 700-meter high rim behind it. Nothing like that in Southern Africa. Driving in the Serengeti, where you have those classic umbrella-shaped thorn trees with a lion lying in it, or of course a leopard. Nothing like that in Southern Africa. So, or herds of wildebeest. We saw the Great Migration down on the Ndutu Plains having given birth, where we literally see it's like someone's just taken pepper and sort of thrown it all across the horizon. Nothing else like that. Lions lying on rocks, rocky outcrops like the Lion King. Nothing like that in Southern Africa. So I have to say, hands down, in terms of the volume of animals in extreme environments, which I love. I absolutely love photographing animals in the environment. Southern Africa doesn't come close to what you can see in East Africa. But, and again, this is quite a big but, driving through the environment and just having a real intimate bush experience where, you know, you feel at one with nature, I actually still think Southern Africa wins. And the reason for that is that peace and quiet in Sightings. It's the 3-vehicle limit, and just the game drives in Southern Africa happens over a much smaller period, and it's a much more planned drive, and that sort of level of guiding where there's a fixed plan, like let's call it a plan between myself as a photographic safari guide and the actual guide or driver, where we go from point A to point B, and we stop here and we look at this view and we listen to the environment, and we maybe listen for lions roaring or leopards calling. I think that actually gives you a wilder experience. So, and that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get better photographs. In fact, in Southern Africa, because it's so dense in most places, it's very hard to get good wildlife photographs because, you know, we live in this sort of woodland savannas or thicker savannas. And that's, again, a reason why Lance and I love going to Mashatu in Botswana, as well as the Okavango Delta, because those areas in Botswana are slightly more open than they are in the Sabi Sands in South Africa. I think I can sum it up in one sentence. As a wildlife photographer, if you enjoy photographing animals in the environment, it's better in East Africa. If you're looking for animal portraits, I think it's better in Southern Africa.
You were saying you loved going through Southern Africa, through the environment, listening to the birds and the trees and all that kind of stuff. I would actually say, and this is kind of counterintuitive, numbers-wise, you will see a lot more animals in East Africa. You will see hundreds of thousands of animals, right? But species-wise, on a typical trip, I would say you'd actually see more in Southern Africa because the vegetation is thicker, so your species of birds goes through the roof. There's a lot of birds in East Africa, but the terrain never kind of changes in a typical game drive. Whereas in Southern Africa, you can drive along a river, you can drive in a woodland, you can drive in an open plain, you can drive in a rocky area, all within a couple of kilometers. So your terrain and your environments change so dramatically in a small amount of place that the variation of species is, I would say, higher, and you see more in Southern Africa.
I totally agree with you. When you first land in the Masai Mara, it's such a strange feeling because the first reaction is, wow, look at it. It's exactly what I expected. Open plains with one or two little trees, and then you see a herd of topi, and you see a herd of Thompson's gazelles and some wildebeest, and it's amazing. But after the second or third drive, you're like, it's more grass. It's more grass. It's just grass as far as you go. And it becomes quite monotonous quickly. And you desperately want to get to the Talak River or the Mara River just for a little bit of variety where you can at least see some hippos or crocodiles or some trees. So I think my suggestion or tip there would be that if you are going to go to East Africa, try and go to more than just the Masai Mara. Try and add Amboseli, where you at least have the marsh, which has a great variety of birds, a slightly different landscape. You've got Mount Kilimanjaro, and first prize obviously is to cross over into Tanzania as well, where you have a much bigger variety in terms of the landscape. But I totally agree with you. I often find that in Southern Africa, my list grows much quicker. And I know it should never be just about the list, but if you enjoy biodiversity and you like seeing, some of the smaller things and you enjoying the bird watching while you're doing the photography, I kind of agree with you that Southern Africa trumps East Africa in that point. But I think let's start wrapping it up. What are your final thoughts? What would you say to people if they have never ever been on safari and they will probably only go once? How do they make the decision between East Africa and Southern Africa?
I was literally just about to say, this is my last sort of point. I'm going to change your question slightly. If you've never been on safari ever before, I would say come to Southern Africa, because you're going to learn a lot more. For the amount of money that you pay, the accommodation will probably be nicer. East Africa is a lot of tented accommodation. Southern Africa is a lot of buildings, so lodges, suites. Some of the suites are bigger than your house, and it's super luxury, and you don't know what to do with it. I would say 100% the food is better in Southern Africa, for sure. So if you've never done a safari, you land in Johannesburg in South Africa. You can also then fly from there very easy to Botswana, to Zambia, to Zimbabwe, or stay in South Africa, depending where you want to go in Southern Africa. But you land, it's very easy. We organize your flight straight into the reserves, a short transfer. You're into a country where the language is a bit better. I think you'd agree with that as well. East Africa, there's a slightly more of a language barrier between Africans and travelers. And then you'll learn a lot more. So you'll see mostly the same species. You'll see less, but you won't know that. You've never been on safari before. You will have great sightings. You'll learn a lot about the bush. You will learn a lot about the animals. And then when you come back, if you go to East Africa or another place in Southern Africa, but if you then go to East Africa, it's like you're doing safari for the first time all over again. Because of the densities and the numbers of animals, it's like a moment. Yeah. If you're not ever coming back, if you're only doing it once ever, then then it's slightly different. If you're never coming back, I would say go to East Africa, see a million different animals, and then it's going to be that once-in-a-lifetime Africa trip. Southern Africa is going to give you that once-in-a-lifetime African trip as well, but a lot of people from the States and the UK and things, they see safari on TV, so a lot of documentaries, and that is East Africa. Most of that is filmed in East Africa, the old David Attenborough documentaries and stuff, where it's the herds of hundreds of thousands of things. So if you're expecting that and that's what you've seen, Southern Africa is not going to give that to you. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question or kind of
no, geez, Lawrence, you absolutely nailed it.
One last thing, if I'll just jump in. Sorry. So we've obviously got a lot of clients who've done both, and a lot of them have actually said to us, if we had done the migration or the herds or the blah 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 first, so this is East Africa, and were blown away, and that was our first experience, and then we came to South Africa and we saw 3 zebras and 5 lions, it can be a bit meh. But interestingly, those same people have just been on a safari where we went to Botswana. So we did see a lot of lions, and there was big herds of stuff because it was in the Delta, and their minds were blown again. So they say that, and it's true to a degree, but so both are amazing. But I would say if you're never coming back, East Africa, if it's your first time and you are coming back, because you will, once you've done safari once, you'll come back. start in Southern Africa.
Yeah, so guys, absolutely, I totally agree with Lance, and go and check out the link in the video description to the Panthera Photo Safaris website, where you'll see all Lance's scheduled safaris for the upcoming year or two. And some of them are to East Africa, some of them are to Southern Africa. And remember, you can also just send him an email and ask him to put a bespoke safari for you to either destination together as well. And then I also want to use this opportunity to thank all our patrons. These are the people that make these videos possible. You'll find links to both those pages in the video description as well if you want to make a monthly donation. On my side, it's basically people that support the Safari Expert YouTube channel, and it just allows me to do this full time. And then you'll also see the link to the Panthera Photo Safaris Conservation Fund, where you can make a monthly donation that'll go to some conservation efforts. Oh, and I also just want to make it clear that we haven't really spoken about the Kruger National Park Public Reserve, where you can do self-drives, and I know a lot of you might have wondered about that as well. We'll cover that in another episode, where we compare the private game reserves in Southern Africa that we just spoke about with the Kruger National Park, where you can do a self-drive safari. Lance, thank you so much for joining me again on the Safari Shots podcast. Looking forward to seeing you again. If I'm correct, in the next episode, we're actually going to be talking about photographic gear.
I believe so. There's a whole bunch of stuff lined up here we can probably chat about. Yeah, sounds good.
Lekker man, I'll see you next time. And remember to leave a like, subscribe to the channel. See you next time.
We seriously need to get an outro.